This is a story called A Concise Guide to Surviving the Cursed Woods by Scare in a Box, under the subreddit Can't Sleep. There are 2 rules you must always adhere to in order to survive in this forest. 1. Never get into a situation where there is no light. 2. Only the sunlight can be trusted. That was what the legend said when they spoke of the infamous Umbra Woods. I tried doing some research before my trip, but I couldn't find much information other than those 2 rules that seemed to crop up no matter what forum or website I visited. I wasn't entirely sure what the second one meant, but it seemed to be important that I didn't find myself in darkness during my trip, so I packed 2 flashlights with extra batteries, just to be on the safe side. I already had the right gear for camping in the woods at night, since this was far from my first excursion into strange, unsettling places. I followed legends and curses like threads, eager to test for myself if the stories were true or nothing more than complex fabricated lies. The Umbra Woods had all manner of strange tales whispered about it, but the general consensus was that the forest was cursed, and those who found themselves beneath the twisted canopy at night met with eerie, unsettling sights and unfortunate ends. A string of people had already disappeared in the forest, but it was the same with any location I visited. Where was the fun without the danger? I entered the woods by the light of dawn. It was early spring, and there was still a chill in the air, the leaves and grass wet with dew, a light mist clinging to the trees. The forest seemed undisturbed at this time, not fully awake. Cobwebs stretched between branches, glimmering like silver thread beneath the sunlight, and the leaves were still. It was surprisingly peaceful, if a little too quiet. I'd barely made it a few steps into the forest when I heard footsteps snaking through the grass behind me. I turned around and saw a young couple entering the woods after me, clad in hiking gear and toting large rucksacks on their back. They saw me, and the man lifted his hand in a polite wave. "Are you here to investigate the Umbra Woods too?" he asked, scratching a hand through his dark stubble. I nodded, the jagged branches of a tree pressing into my back. "I like to chase mysteries," I supplied in lieu of explanation. "The forest is indeed very mysterious," the woman said, her blue eyes sparkling like gems. "What do you think we'll find here?" I shrugged. I wasn't looking for anything here. I just wanted to experience the woods for myself, so that I might better understand the rumors they whispered about. "Why don't we walk together for a while?" the woman suggested, and since I didn't have a reason not to, I agreed. We kept the conversation light as we walked, concentrating on the movement of the woods around us. I wasn't sure what the wildlife was like here, but I had caught snatches of movement amongst the undergrowth while walking. I'd yet to glimpse anything more than scurrying shadows, though. The light waned a little in the darker, thicker areas of the forest, but never faded, and never consigned us to darkness. In some places, where the canopy was sparse and the gray sunlight poured through, the grass was tall and lush. Other places were bogged down with leaf rot and mud, making it harder to traverse. At midday, we stopped for lunch. Like me, the couple had brought canteens of water and a variety of energy bars and trail mix to snack on. I retrieved a granola bar from my rucksack and chewed on it while listening to the tree bark creak in the wind. When I was finished, I dusted the crumbs off with my fingers and watched the leaves at my feet start trembling as things crept out to retrieve what I'd dropped, dragging them back down into the earth. I took a swig of water from my flask and put it away again. I'd brought enough supplies to last a few days, though I only intended on staying one night. But places like these could become disorientating and difficult to leave sometimes, trapping you in a cage of old, rotten bark and skeletal leaves. "Left nothing behind?" the man said, checking his surroundings before nodding. "Right, let's get going then." I did the same, making sure I hadn't left anything that didn't belong here, then trailed after them, batting aside twigs and branches that reached towards me across the path. Something grabbed my foot as I was walking, and I looked down, my heart lurching at what it might be. An old root had gotten twisted around my ankle somehow, spidery green veins snaking along my shoes. I shook it off, being extra vigilant of where I was putting my feet. I didn't want to fall into another trap, or hurt my foot by stepping somewhere I shouldn't. "We're going to go a bit further, and then make camp," the woman told me over her shoulder, quickly looking forward again when she stumbled. We had yet to come across another person in the forest, and while it was nice to have some company, I'd probably separate from them when they set up camp. I wasn't ready to stop yet. I wanted to go deeper still. A small clearing parted the trees ahead of us, an open area of grass and moss, with a darkened patch of ground in the middle from a previous campfire. Nearby, I heard the soft trickle of water running across the ground. The stream? "Here looks like a good place to stop," the man observed, peering around and testing the ground with his shoe. The woman agreed. "I'll be heading off now," I told them, hoisting my rucksack as it began to slip down off my shoulder. "Be careful out there," the woman warned, and I nodded, thanking them for their company and wishing them well. It was strange walking on my own after that. Listening to my own footsteps crunching through leaves sounded lonely, and I almost felt like my presence was disturbing something it shouldn't. I tried not to let those thoughts bother me, glancing around at the trees and watching the sun move across the sky between the canopy. The time on my cell phone read 15:19, so there were still several hours before nightfall. I'd planned on seeing how things went before deciding whether to stay overnight or leave before dusk, but since nothing much happened yet, I was determined to keep going. I paused a few more times to drink from my canteen and snack on some berries and nuts, keeping my energy up. During one of my breaks, the trees on my left began to tremble, something moving between the sloping boughs. I stood still and waited for it to reveal itself, the frantic rustling drawing closer, until a small bird appeared that I'd never seen before, with black-tipped wings that seemed to shimmer with a dark blue fluorescence and milky white eyes. Something about the bird reminded me of the sky at night, and I wondered what kind of species it was. As soon as it caught sight of me, it darted away, chirping softly. I thought about sprinkling some nuts around me to coax it back, but I decided against it. I didn't want to attract any different, more unsavory creatures. If there were birds here I'd never seen before, then who knew what else called the Umbra Woods their home? Gradually, the daylight started to wane, and the forest grew dimmer and livelier at the same time. Shadows rustled through the leaves, and the soil shifted beneath my feet, like things were getting ready to surface. It grew darker beneath the canopy, gloom coalescing between the trees, and although I could still see fine, I decided to recheck my equipment. Pausing by a fallen log, I set down my bag and rifled through it for one of the flashlights. When I switched it on, it spat out a quiet, skittering burst of light, then went dark. I frowned and tried flipping it on and off again, but it didn't work. I whacked it a few times against my palm, jostling the batteries inside, but that did nothing either. Odd. I grabbed the second flashlight and switched it on, but it did the same thing. The light died almost immediately. I had put new batteries in that same morning, fresh from the packet, no cast-off or half-drained ones. I'd even tried them in the village on the edge of the forest just to make sure, and they had been working fine then. How had they run out of power already? Grumbling in annoyance, I dug the spare batteries out of my pack and replaced them inside both flashlights. I held my breath as I flicked on the switch, a sinking dread settling in the pit of my stomach when they still didn't work. Both of them were completely dead. What was I supposed to do now? I couldn't go wandering through the forest in darkness. The rules had been very explicit about not letting yourself get trapped with no light. I knew I should have turned back at that point, but I decided to stay. I had other ways of generating light. A fire would keep the shadows at bay, and when I checked my cell phone, the screen produced a faint glow, though it remained dim. At least the battery hadn't completely drained, like in the flashlights. Though out here, with no service, I doubted it would be very useful in any situation. I walked for a little longer, but stopped when the darkness started to grow around me. Dusk was gathering rapidly, the last remnants of sunlight peeking through the canopy. I should stop and get a fire going before I found myself lost in the shadows. I backtracked to an empty patch of ground that I'd passed, where the canopy was open and there were no overhanging branches or thick undergrowth, and started building my fire, stacking pieces of kindling and tinder in a small circle. Then I pulled out a match and struck it. holding the bright flame to the wood and watching it ignite, spreading further into the fire pit. With a soft, pleasant crackle, the fire burned brighter, and I let out a sigh of relief. At least now I had something to ward off the darkness. But as the fire continued to burn, I noticed there was something strange about it. Something that didn't make any sense. Despite all the flickering and snaking of the flames, there were no shadows cast in its vicinity. The fire burned almost as a separate entity, touching nothing around it. As dusk fell and the darkness grew, it only became more apparent. The fire wasn't illuminating anything. I held my hand in front of it, feeling the heat lick my palms, but the light did not spread across my skin. Was that what was meant by the second rule? Light had no effect in the forest, unless it came from the sun? I watched a bug flit too close to the flames, buzzing quietly. An ember spat out of the mouth of the fire and incinerated it in the fraction of a second, leaving nothing behind. What was I supposed to do? If the fire didn't emit any light, did that mean I was in danger? The rumors never said what would happen if I found myself alone in the darkness, but the number of people who had gone missing in this forest was enough to make me cautious. I didn't want to end up as just another statistic. I had to get somewhere with light, real light, before it got full dark. I was too far from the exit to simply run from it. I was safer to stay where I was. Only the sunlight can be trusted. I lifted my gaze to the sky, clear between the canopy. The sun had already set long ago, but the pale crescent of the moon glimmered through the trees. If the surface of the moon was simply a reflection of the sun, did it count as sunlight? I had no choice at this point. I had to hope that the reasoning was sound. The fire started to die out fairly quickly once I stopped feeding it kindling. While it fended off the chill of the night, it did nothing to hold the darkness back. I could feel it creeping around me, getting closer and closer. If it wasn't for the strands of thin, silvery moonlight that crept down onto the forest floor and basked my skin in a faint glow, I would be in complete darkness. As long as the moon kept shining on me, I should be fine. But as the night drew on and the sky dimmed further, the canopy itself seemed to thicken, as if the branches were threading closer together, blocking out more and more of the moon's glow. If this continued, I would no longer be in the light. The fire had shrunk to a faint flicker now, so I let it burn out on its own, a chill settling over my skin as soon as I got to my feet. I had to go where the moonlight could reach me, which meant my only option was going up. If I could find a nice nook of bark to rest in above the tree line, I should be in direct contact with the moonlight for the rest of the night. Hoisting the bag onto my shoulders, I walked up to the nearest tree and tested the closest branch with my hand. It seemed sturdy enough to hold my weight while I climbed. Taking a deep breath of cool night air, I pulled myself up, my shoes scrabbling against the bark in search of a proper foothold. Part of the tree was slippery with sap and moss, and I almost slipped a few times, the branches creaking sharply as I balanced all of my weight onto them, but I managed to right myself. Some of the smaller twigs scraped over my skin and tangled in my hair as I climbed, my backpack thumping against the small of my back. The tree seemed to stretch on forever, and just when I thought I was getting close to its crown, I would look up and find more branches above my head, as if the tree had sprouted more when I wasn't looking. Finally, my head broke through the last layer of leaves, and I could finally breathe now that I was free from the cloying atmosphere between the branches. I brushed pieces of dry bark off my face and looked around for somewhere to sit. The moonlight danced along the leaves, illuminating a deep groove inside the tree, just big enough for me to comfortably sit. My legs ached from the exertion of climbing, and although the bark was lumpy and uncomfortable, I was relieved to sit down. The bone-white moon gazed down on me, washing the shadows from my skin. As long as I stayed above the tree line, I should be able to get through the night. It was rather peaceful up here. I felt like I might reach up and touch the stars if I wanted to, their soft, twinkling lights dotting the velvet sky like diamonds. A wind began to rustle through the leaves, carrying a breath of frost, and I wish I'd stayed down by the fire. Would the chill get me before the darkness could? I wrapped my jacket tighter around my shoulders, breathing into my hands to keep them warm. I tried to check my phone for the time, but the screen had dimmed so much that I couldn't see a thing. It was useless. With a sigh, I put it away and nestled deeper into the tree, tucking my hands beneath my armpits to stay warm. Above me, the moon shone brightly, making the treetops glow silver. I started to doze, lulled into a dreamy state by the smiling moon and the rustling breeze. Just as I was on the precipice of sleep, something at the back of my mind tugged me awake. A feeling, perhaps an instinctual warning, that something was going to happen. I lifted my gaze to the sky and gave a start. A thick wisp of cloud was about to pass over the moon. If it blocked the light completely, wouldn't I be trapped in darkness? "Please, change your direction," I shouted, my sudden loudness startling a bird from the tree next to me. Perhaps I was simply imagining it, in a sleep-induced haze, but the cloud stopped moving, only the very edge creeping across the moon. I blinked. Had the cloud heard me? And then, in a tenuous whispering voice, the cloud replied, "Play with me, then. Hide and seek." I watched in a mixture of amazement and bewilderment as the cloud began to drift downwards, towards the forest, in a breezy, elegant motion. It passed between the trees, leaving glistening wet leaves in its wake, and disappeared. I stared after it, my heart thumping hard in my chest. The cloud really had just spoken to me. But despite its wish to play hide-and-seek, I had no intention of leaving my treetop perch. Up here, I knew I was safe in the moonlight. At least now the sky had gone clear again, no more clouds threatening to sully the glow of the moon. As long as the sky stayed empty and the moon stayed bright, I should make it until morning. I didn't know what time it was, but several hours must have passed since dusk had fallen. I started to feel sleepy, but the cloud's antics had put me on edge, and I was worried something else might happen if I closed my eyes again. What if the cloud came back and realized I wasn't actually searching for it? It was a big forest, so there was no guarantee I'd even manage to find it. Hopefully the cloud stayed hidden and wouldn't come back to threaten my safety again. I fought the growing heaviness in my eyes, the wind gently playing with my hair. After a while, I could no longer fight it and started to doze off, nestled by the creaking bark and soft leaves. I awoke some time later in near darkness. Panic tightened in my chest as I sat up, realizing the sky above me was empty. Where was the moon? I spied its faint silvery glow on the horizon, just starting to dip out of sight. But dawn was still a while away, and without the moon, I would have no viable light source. "Where are you going?" I called after the moon, not completely surprised when it answered me back. Its voice was soft and lyrical, like a lullaby, but its words filled me with sinking dread. "Today I'm only working half period. Sorry." I stared in rising fear as the moon slipped over the edge of the horizon, the sky an impossibly dark expanse above me. Was this it? Was I finally going to be swallowed by the shadowy forest? My eyes narrowed closed, my heart thumping hard in my chest at what was going to happen now that I was surrounded by darkness, until I noticed, through my slitted gaze, soft pinpricks of orange light surrounding me. My eyes flew open and I sat up with a gasp, gazing at the glowing creatures floating between the branches around me. Fireflies. Their glimmering lights could also hold the darkness at bay. A tear welled up in the corner of my eye and slid down my cheek in relief. "You came to save me," I murmured, watching the little insects flutter around me, their lights fluctuating in an unknown rhythm. A quiet, chirping voice spoke close to my ear, soft wings brushing past my cheek. "We can share our lights with you until morning." My eyes widened, and I stared at the bug hopefully. "You will?" The firefly bobbed up and down at the edge of my vision. "Yes, we charge by the hour." I blinked. I had to pay them? Did fireflies even need money? As if sensing my hesitation, the firefly squeaked. "Your friends down there refused to pay and ended up drowning to their deaths." My friends? Did they mean the couple I had been walking with earlier that morning? I felt a pang of guilt that they hadn't made it, but I was sure they knew the risks of visiting a forest like this, just as much as I did. If they came unprepared or unaware of the rules, this was their fate from the start. Okay, I said, knowing that I didn't have much of a choice. If the fireflies disappeared, I wouldn't survive until morning. This was my last chance to stay in the light. How do I pay you? The firefly flew past my face and hovered by the tree trunk, illuminating a small slot inside the bark, like the card slot of an ATM machine. At least they accepted card. I had no cash on me at all. I dug through my rucksack and retrieved my credit card, hesitantly sliding it into the gap. Would putting it inside the tree really work? But then I saw a faint glow inside the trunk, and an automated voice spoke from within. Your card was charged money. Wait, how much was it charging? Leave your card in there, the firefly instructed, and we'll stay for as long as you pay us. Okay, I said. I guess I really did have no choice. With the moon having already abandoned me, I had nothing else to rely on but these little lightning bugs to keep the darkness from swallowing me. The fireflies were fun to watch as they fluttered around me, their glowing lanterns spreading a warm, cozy glow across the treetop I was resting in. I dozed a little bit, but every hour the automated voice inside the tree would wake me up with its alert. Your card was charged money. At least now I was able to keep track of how much time was passing. Several hours passed, and the sky remained dark with the fireflies fluttered around, sometimes landing on my arms and warming my skin, sometimes murmuring in voices I couldn't quite hear. It lent an almost dreamlike quality to everything, and sometimes I wouldn't be sure if I was asleep or awake until I heard that voice again, reminding me that I was paying to stay alive every hour. More time passed, and I was starting to wonder if the night was ever going to end. I'd lost track of how many times my card had been charged, and my stomach started to growl in hunger. I reached for another granola bar, munching on it while the quiet night pressed around me. Then, from within the tree, the voice spoke again. This time, the message was different. There are not enough funds on this card. Please try another one. I jolted up in alarm, spraying granola crumbs into the branches as the tree spat my used credit card out. What? I didn't have another card. What was I supposed to do now? I turned to the fireflies, but they were already starting to disperse. But wait! Bye-bye, the fireflies squeaked before they all scattered, leaving me alone. You mercenary flies, I shouted angrily after them, sinking back into despair. What now? Just as I was trying to consider my options, a streaky gray light cut across the treetops, and when I lifted my gaze to the horizon, I glimpsed the faint shimmer of the sun just beginning to rise. Dawn was finally here. I waited up in the tree as the sun gradually rose, chasing away the chill of the night. I'd made it. I'd survived. When the entire forest was bathed in its golden, sparkling light, I finally climbed down from the tree. I was a little sluggish and tired, and my muscles were cramped from sitting in a nook of bark all night, and I slipped a few times on the dewy branches, but I finally made it back onto the solid, leafy ground. The remains of my fire had gone cold and dry, the only trace I was ever here. Checking that I had everything with me, I started back through the woods, trying to retrace my path. A few broken twigs and half-buried footprints were all I had to go on, but that was enough to assure me I was heading the right way. The forest was, as it had been the morning before, quiet and sleepy, not a trace of life. It made my footfalls sound impossibly loud, every snapping branch and crunching leaf echoing for miles around me. It made me feel like I was the only living thing in the entire woods. I kept walking until, through the trees ahead of me, I glimpsed a swath of dark fabric. A tent? Then I remembered, this must have been where the couple had set up their camp. A sliver of regret and sadness wrapped around me. They'd been kind to me yesterday, and it was a shame they hadn't made it through the night. The fireflies hadn't been lying after all. I pushed through the trees and paused in the small clearing, looking around. Everything looked still and untouched. The tent was still zipped closed, as if they were sleeping soundly inside. Were their bodies still in there? I shuddered at the thought, before noticing something odd. The ground around the tent was soaked, puddles of water seeping through the leaf-sodden earth. What was with all the water? Where had it come from? The fireflies had mentioned the couple had drowned, but how had the water gotten here in the first place? Mildly curious, I walked up to the tent and pressed a hand against it. The fabric was heavy and moist, completely saturated with water. When I pressed further, more clear water pumped out of the base, soaking through my shoes and the ground around me. The tent was completely full of water. If I pulled down the zip, it would come flooding out in a tidal wave. Then it struck me, the only possibility as to how the tent had filled with so much water: the cloud. It had descended into the forest, bidding me to play hide-and-seek with it. Was this where the cloud was hiding? Inside the tent? I pulled away and spoke, rather loudly. I wonder where that cloud went. Oh, cloud, where are you? I'll find you. The tent began to tremble joyfully, and I heard a stifled giggle from the inside. I'm coming, Mr. Cloud. Instead of opening the tent, I began to walk away. I didn't want to risk getting bogged down in the flood, and if I found the cloud, it would be my turn to hide. The woods were dangerous enough without trying to play games with a bundle of condensed vapor. It was better to leave it where it was. Eventually, it would give up. From the couple's campsite, I kept walking, find it easier to retrace our path now that there were more footprints and marks to follow. Yesterday's trip through these trees had already felt like a distant memory, after everything that had happened between then. At least now, I knew to be more cautious of the rules when entering strange places. The trees thinned out, and I finally stepped out of the forest, the heavy, cloying atmosphere of the canopy lifting from my shoulders now that there was nothing above me but the clear blue sky. Out of curiosity, I reached into my bag for the flashlights and tested them. Both switched on, as if there had been nothing wrong with them at all. My cell phone, too, was back to full illumination, the battery still half charged and the service flickering in and out of range. Despite everything, I'd managed to make it through the night. I pulled up the memo app on my phone and checked the Umbra Woods off my to-do list. A slightly more challenging location than I had envisioned, but nonetheless an experience I would never forget. Now it was time to get some proper sleep and start preparing for my next location. After all, there were always more mysteries to chase.